We're just starting right now. Hello, everyone. My name is Leslie Cordy, and I am the Director at Large for AAACE, which is the American Association for Adult and Continuing Education. Thank you for joining us today. We are very pleased to have a very great presenter with us. What I'll say is first is I'm going to do some technological announcements. So if you're just joining us now, please make sure that you can hear us and see both the PowerPoint presentation and the folks who are zooming in. Second of all, if you're just joining us, please make sure that your microphone is muted so that we can allow for the presenter to speak and also for questions to kind of come and go without any distracting background noise. If you do have problems with technology, please feel free to post a question or a concern in the Zoom group chat, and we will try to help you with those technology issues. And lastly, though, this is supposed to be an interactive presentation, and so we do welcome you to interrupt the presenter with a question or a thought. You are free to speak to the presenter directly. You don't necessarily have to be facilitated by us, but you are also free to pose a question or comment in the group chat, and we will try to monitor that as best as possible. So those are my techie announcements for you today. We are recording this session, and so it will be posted at the AAACE website under the International Compendium archives, and I'll go over that at the very end. So without further ado, I'd like to address and introduce our presenter for today, which is on the Compendium Article 73, which is "The Past is Always Present." And we are so lucky to have Dr. Amy Rose with us today. I will do her official announcement. She is a professor emeritus of adult education at Northern Illinois University, where she was a professor for over 25 years and continues to work with folks in adult education. She has written and presented on numerous issues related to history and policy in terms of literacy, women and adults in higher education. Right now, her research focuses primarily on historical and qualitative methodologies, and she's been recently part of some research which had to do with the PAACE data, and I'm not very good at that acronym, Amy, so you can help me with that in a minute. I always call it PAACE. She has been the co-editor of the Handbook of Adult and Continuing Education, and she's been a co-author in terms of a book called Professional Foundations of Adult and Continuing Education. She's also served as a past president for AAACE. She's been a co-editor for the Adult Education Quarterly, and she's presently the co-editor for a new journal, which is the Adult Literacy Education, the International Journal of Literacy, Language, and Numeracy, which is also with another association, Pro-Literacy. Besides being a past president, she's currently presently a board member for the International Society for Comparative and Adult Education, and she was inducted into the International Adult and Continuing Education Hall of Fame. Phew. We are very lucky to have her, and I want to say as a personal note, she's been just a valuable mentor and resource to many of us, including myself. So welcome, Amy, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Oh, thank you, Leslie. That was very kind. Hopefully, we will breeze right through this presentation. And I want to tell you how really excited I am to be here today and to get a chance to talk a little bit about history and historical research and my own particular take on it. I would like to, at this point, tell everyone to feel free to interrupt me through a note I think is the best way to go, right, Leslie? Or can they just unmute for a second, or would that be?
They can do both. So I will watch for them in the chat room, and I will also stop you if they're trying to ask you a question.
Okay. And I'm not committed to getting through all of this. I have about a 35-minute presentation if I read really fast or discuss really fast. So we'll just see how this goes because I'd much prefer to have a discussion. As Leslie said, my area has been mostly my area of research has been mostly history and policy of adult education. And the history part has been pretty broad. So I've looked at a lot of different parts of the history of adult education. Although how I came to do the particular pieces that I did is part of what I want to talk about today. So some of my work has focused on the professionalization of the field, particularly in the 1920s, but going really up through the present time. Kathy Hansman and I have been working for several years now on a history of the professoriate and how it developed. I've done quite a bit of work on various aspects of the history of the GED, and related to that history, the history related to the GI Bill of Rights of 1954. Is there somebody not muted? Ah, okay. Then I've also worked on the Adult Education Act of 1966, and I've worked on some aspects of women in adult education in the 1920s and 1930s, and on the Chautauqua Institution. So I think you'll see a trend here already if you think about it, which is that although I started as a social historian, the fact is that within adult education, it's a bit easier to look at organizations, institutions, and the government than it is to look at other aspects of adult education. And I am guilty of that as well as anyone. So I wanted to lay that out there before I even started. But the other piece that I wanted to share with you is that once I started to get into some of these issues, I think you can see that there's been very little research on really any aspect of adult education. So that the big things like how did the association get founded or the GED have been very understudied. Not to say they haven't been studied at all, but they've been understudied. So I think that's important to say up front, and to say that if you're interested in doing historical research, there's really plenty of room to do it. So let's see if this is going to work. Okay. So these are the organizing questions that were out already. I don't think I need to go over them, except to say that to me, the biggest question that we're coming into this today with is, well, what's the value of historical research? Is it any value to a field that really is just working to improve practice? But it's true for any practical area. How do we ascribe value to it? How do we do it? How do we understand it? How do we find documents to back us up? So those are the parameters of today. And I think that the last part, we'll see if we get to it or not, is, well, how do you construct history? Because history is all interpretation. And so part of the interpretation is constructing categories and categorizing what you find. And how do you do that? And I've done that preliminarily with the history of adult education in general, but we'll see how far we get today. So the value of history is not really clear. There are lots of ways to think about the value of history. Just studying history in general gets you to think about how life developed, how institutions developed, how our country developed, how the world developed. It looks at culture and puts culture into context. But what exactly are we supposed to learn from the past? So a lot of people fall back on that old Santana saying that those who do not study history are doomed to repeat it. Could you mute yourself? Thank you. But basically, my argument here would be that historians look at the particular, and therefore any situation that might seem generically similar probably isn't, and therefore you are not doomed to repeat it based on the past, because history is not, the study of history is not generally predictive. However, what it can do is help us understand change over time, place issues into historical context, relate themes to a bigger issue that you may not realize was going on in the world, and help us understand, most importantly, how we got to this moment in time so that we can better plan for the future. Prediction is not a goal. However, with it's an important information in order to move forward. If we don't know where we've been, we're constantly reinventing the wheel, looking at things in the same way, and it's very important that we understand how we got to the particular point in time. The only other thing I want to say is very often people use history to make analogies. So they will say, well, this was handled this way in the past, and therefore we don't want to do it again this way. That is a dangerous way to use history. And so analogies are helpful in helping us understand a situation, but we want to understand that each moment in time is unique. And because something didn't work in the past doesn't mean it won't work now, or if it worked in the past, that it might work now. And the biggest pieces that I can think of to illustrate this is in the entry to World War I, people were very concerned that propaganda had gotten them into World War I, and that it hadn't been really necessary for the United States to get into World War I. So as things started to heat up for World War II, they were very concerned about propaganda again, and at the highest levels of government held back from intervention when intervention might have been easier, because that was the lesson that they had learned from World War I. This is not my analogy. It's in a book about historical fallacies. But anyway, that's the most blatant one. Within education, we don't have such clear-cut ideas, but I think it's very important to remember that as we move forward, and as you move forward thinking historically. So additionally, history is about the creation of stories. So we all create stories about our own individual past, about our institutional past, our professional past, and those are open to constant reinterpretation and change. And as you, as the reader or the listener, are there, you need to be thinking, well, what's the ultimate aim of this story? Where is it going? Is it trying to just buttress up the field, or is it looking to critique the field? Is it looking to add to our knowledge generally? And in this sense, I want to say one other thing, which is that nothing is just purely good, purely good or purely bad. In children's education, for example, there's been this long debate about whether the education of children was oppressive. Children are forced to go to school, so was a school really an instrument for social mobility, or was it a way to train workers to work in factories and not help them gain social mobility? This was a very hot topic in the 70s and the 80s and the 60s. It's kind of died down now because people realize it was a little bit of both. But in adult education, when we ask those questions, it isn't always generally clear how that would work, since adult education is not mandatory in the same way that children's education is. So let's look a little bit at the meaning of the history of adult education. And for this, I'm thinking of looking at the books. We could look at articles, but we'd be here all day. And there are very few books in the US that give a total history of adult education. There are more in other countries, but I'm just focusing on adults here. So adults, the first book for the history of adult education was written by Adams in 1944, and that was during World War II, and he saw adult education as the prime mover behind the dissemination of culture. That adult education and culture went hand in hand, and that we could not understand culture without understanding adult education. Grattan, writing during the Cold War, wrote his book from the perspective that adult education was a necessity for the development of democracy. Now, Knowles in 1970, but it was an adaptation of his dissertation written much earlier, he was looking at adult education from the perspective of the field. He was the executive director of the Adult Education Association of the USA, and he saw the field in the 50s and 60s as reaching the culmination of organization and administration. And he was looking at the history in terms of the way it led to the formation of this association. Joseph Kett was not an adult educator, neither were Grattan and Adams, but Knowles and Stubblefield and Keene were. And Kett was looking at the history of self-improvement. So he's interesting because he was not really talking about the development of the field, but he was looking at how people learned to apply themselves for informal, non-formal, or even formal learning, but only towards self-improvement. And when he talked about adult education, that is what he meant. To the point that when adult education began to organize, he thought it was dead. So he had a very particular point of views. So my only point here, by giving you all of these as perspectives, is to say there's no one way to approach it. What you do is you take the same facts, the same instances, and you interpret them in different ways.
Amy, could I interrupt and ask you perhaps what you've had a lot of information in terms of about the historical perspective, and perhaps even though there's been research, but there's a lack of research. Is there a recommendation in terms of where we might start in terms of developing this research? Is there a particular methodology or source that you, besides these books, would recommend?
Well, there are a lot of books on historical methodology, but where you start is with your questions. So excellent segue, Leslie. So, but your questions, what I want to emphasize to you is that your questions can come from anywhere. So I'd like to give you an example of that. So my background is in history and adult education, they're both. But I was working in prior learning assessment, and how I came to studying the GI Bill was through my work in prior learning assessment. I was looking for the antecedents of prior learning assessment in higher education, and that took me back to the 1940s and earlier. So that my question was, well, where did this idea come from? And where it really started is in the 1930s, but where it took off was in the 1940s when they were trying to accelerate both high school and college experiences for returning veterans. So my question was very presentist, but as I went back in time, I realized that this was much more complex than I ever would have dreamt, and that it had to do with a history of planning, because in the 1940s, planning was considered to be a communist activity. One didn't plan. in the same way. So the planners had to be thinking about how to plan without overtly stating they were planning. And I will say that the planning for deployment for the returning veterans started before Pearl Harbor. So that will give you an idea. So they started in November of 1941, planning what they were going to do with the returning veterans after the war. So the questions can come from anywhere. Now, very often they come from reading other histories, but for us in our field, we have very pressing questions that can come from our practice, and that's completely fine. But the thing about history is it focuses on the unique. So you want to, at the same time, look for the unique, the particular piece that you're going to be able to study. Let me go on to the next slide here.
So we have a comment or sort of question too on that, Amy. So is it fair to say where you begin depends on context?
Well, it depends on your own context for sure. And then it also depends on the historical context of the time. So yes, context is everything, but it's not clear cut. There's no one way to approach it. So I laid out, how did the field develop? That's something that's interesting me right now, but it may not interest you. So how did the field develop? Well, that question came to me because of present problems in the field today, particularly among the professors. So how did academic programs for adult education start? What were they? What were their aims? How did they fit into the university? How did they change over time? Those are all things that I'm looking at now coming from my present context. But the other thing is to ask, you could, for your own context, is to say who was left out. Once you start reading, you may realize other people are left out of the discussion. Remember, in the beginning, I said that the study of history is a narrative, and who constructs the narrative tells you a lot about what they view as important, but that is not what everyone views as important. So who was left out is crucial to understanding that. And then the repercussions for everyone, for who was included, who was left out, how were decisions made. Those are all vital things. Then the other piece of it is you may want to take a narrow piece. Like I talked about those big studies, but there are only those 5 books. That's all. But there are other works that look at the history of African American adult education, the history of women in education, Native Americans in education, and all of that is extremely important. And they're different strands. And so those two are who's left out, how can we turn the light on other groups? And so we want to keep this both as broad as possible while you in your own work, or me in my own work, focus on the particular. I'm going to keep coming back to this context question. So what interests the historian, one other thing to keep in mind about method, which is that you're looking through documents, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But as you're looking at documents, you have to realize that that your strand may not be what was important to the writer or the principal people involved. So this is what makes history daunting. For example, 2 very extremely well-known educational psychologists were involved in developing the GED. They were Ralph Tyler from the University of Chicago and E.F. Lindquist from the University of Iowa. And they had very long, extremely long, storied, influential careers. They were probably the 2 of the most important educational psychologists of the 20th century. So if you go through their papers, there's not going to be that much on the GED in there. There will be something, but not much. So therefore, you're going to have to go look at who they wrote to and their archives. When I was doing this work, I went to Washington, I went to Chicago, I went to Iowa, I went to Syracuse where the adult education archives were, but there was very little there. I went to the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and then there were other papers that I just couldn't get to. So you're following a trail that takes you in a lot of different directions. So that gets us to the key question, Leslie, which comes back to I think to what you were asking, or maybe not, which is how do you study history? You study history through, for the most part, documents and oral histories. And they're primary documents. Primary documents are documents that were written at the time. So diaries, letters, wills, newspapers written at the time, newspaper articles written at the time, sometimes books written at the time, depending. So you're looking for all of these documents. Now you can also use oral histories to back up what you find, but oral histories by themselves rarely stand alone because people's memories are notoriously weak. They're very good if you want to know how someone felt about something. People tend to remember their emotions, but they don't always remember the specifics. And if someone tells you something specifically, you need to make sure that you have other data to back it up. So there are very few records for who participates, for example. And as I said before, so we're really limited. If we have no records, we can do a lot oral histories, and if you get more than one oral history, you can build something, but it's very hard to do that. So that has limited the kinds of histories that get written in this field. The other thing is that even the records for programs are weak. So there are school records for turn of the century schools, and you can go and get them. But there are very few records for turn of the century adult education programs. And so you cannot go get them. And of course, if it was in a college or university now, it used to be you could go and look at those, but now you can't either. So there are historical facts, and there are facts. That's a non-political statement. There are facts, and facts have to be something that's verified, and they're verified through the documents, the interviews, and everything else that you have. And there are three things that basically you're looking for in the fact. You're looking for authenticity. Is it authentic? Is it real? Was it really generated at the time? Now that's usually the easiest thing to figure out, but because especially in this field, there aren't that many inauthentic documents. But it's something to keep in mind if someone shows up on your doorstep with important letters that nobody else has ever heard of before. Then you have to look at the context of the document to understand where the writer is coming from, what their particular perspective is, so that you're not just taking what they say as truth. And then, is it credible, which is related to the context. So a document can be authentic without necessarily being credible. So you take some of the things, for example, the big one here is Theodore Roosevelt. He was known to exaggerate. Therefore, if you take what he wrote as credible, you may get yourself into trouble, and you have to second guess almost everything that he wrote. So once you decide that an event has occurred and you gather your information about it or about an intellectual trend or whatever it is that you're looking at, then your next step is to interpret it. And interpretation is the key part. You and I, or all of us together, we could look at a document and have different interpretations. And as long as we back that up, that is fine. But there are certain, you have to ask yourself, what does it mean? What caused it? What are the ramifications? Those are all part of the interpretive process. But you have to do that interpretation without ascribing causality generally because there are connections that you just can't make. And that's very difficult because as we read for anything, we want to ascribe causality. And in general, historical research cannot tell you causality. It's just one of the problems. We can kind of understand where we came from, but can we say for sure that A caused B? No, no, we cannot. And another important part is that historians look chronologically. So we organize thematically, but within the themes, we organize chronologically. Now, there is an assumption in there that we need to understand A before we get to B, before we get to C, and that's why the chronology is in there. But can we really say that A caused B? No, we cannot, usually. Once in a while, but usually not. Because there are different interpretations and new pieces of information may emerge at any moment to destroy our argument. That's why history is never closed. It is constantly being reinterpreted. So, okay, I guess I'm at the halfway mark. So let me just ask, although I've got 20 minutes in, before I start in the second half, which I could take or leave, are there any questions? Okay, well then I'll just show you how I've categorized. So part of the interpretive process is categorization. And this is taken from the book that I co-authored with Jovita Ross Gordon and Carol Caseworm. And we divided the history of adult education into these 5 areas: adulthood and diffusion, higher education, basic education, work-related education, and social change and social justice. And so there are other ways you could do it, and I might even do it differently now. I'm kind of, as I've been preparing for this, I've been kind of rethinking these, but they'll do for now because they're just a starting off point. And when you do this kind of analysis, you're looking for patterns when you establish categories. And you're also looking to see, well, what questions are we answering when we do that? So for me, I was looking for the organizations and the purpose of each of these, within each of these categories. So let's just move forward a little and you'll see what I'm talking about. So really, what's interesting is that although we talk about adulthood and it seems like adulthood has been, people have always been adults, but really this notion of adulthood as an area of study by itself, as opposed to just being life, is relatively modern. And in fact, it was the last phase of life to be invented or discovered. So Philip Arié started this area of study when he wrote a book about the discovery of childhood. And he was looking at the way that childhood began to be segmented from adulthood, so that instead of children being seen as just miniature adults, they had their own ways of learning, their own ways of being, their own psychology. And this started during the Renaissance, really, and then really took off later. And there are a lot of questions about Arié's work, which you don't need to get into here. It's just a way of saying, well, people started to be thinking about childhood in a different way. Then in the late 19th century, G. Stanley Hall, who was a psychologist, started writing about adolescence and the teenage years. And his work was extremely influential in really examining the psychology of teenagers in a way that had not been done before. Now, we could also argue that the notion of adolescence was a modern notion because really, before the spread of the high school, adolescents were adults. So nothing is clear, but as he was writing, adolescence and high schools were becoming important. More people were going to college, although that really happened in the 20th century. But the discovery of adolescence paved the way for thinking about that segment. And then in the early 20th century, people started to write about old age. And it wasn't until the 1920s that psychologists began to look at adulthood, adult learning, the ways that adults were different than children. And so surprisingly, adulthood was the last segment to be discovered with quotation marks, because in fact, of course, people have been writing about adulthood since writing began. But that was just life, human life. So once you have adulthood, however, then we say, well, how do these people learn? And what is it that they want to learn? And this category that I'm looking at is the broadest, diffusion of knowledge, self-enrichment. It's what Ket wrote about. And it's how did adults gain information for themselves? It could have been through formal means, but they went out and got it for themselves in a variety of ways. And these included, in America, learned societies, mutual aid societies, reform groups, lyceums, and Chautauqua, just to name a few. There are many more. So learned societies are particularly interested because the learned societies in the beginning were societies of inventors and innovators, and they were not made up of experts. They were made up of farmers and mechanics, and as were the mechanics institutes, who got together to talk about innovation. And the principal idea was that they would innovate and then go home and do it. So they would be presented with something, they would go home and test it, come back and report. They were very much involved in the experimental period. And what we see happening as we go through the 19th and early 20th century is that this notion of learning by doing became segmented. So you learned by doing, but you did not create knowledge while you were doing that. And it was the creation of knowledge that really came to be seen as an area of expertise. And the reform groups used education as a way of gaining adherence. And it could be to get people to read the Bible. It could be to provide education. The lyceums were founded originally, although they became speakers bureaus, they were founded to drum up support for public education in the 1830s. So let's take an example of the Free Africa Society. This is interesting because it was the freed slaves, or free African Americans. They weren't all slaves. And it was chartered in 1787, so it went back very far. And it was a mutual aid society. And there were white counterparts already. In white mutual aid society, they would help their members if they needed money. They would help with burials. But it became a social club. And as it became connected to churches, it also began to have religious connotations. And they ran classes as well. And reform groups such as the American Bible Society ran Sunday schools for all groups. And they were for adults and for children. And even from the early 19th century, they did keep track of how many adults that they were.
Amy, we just lost you for a minute, but I think you're back.
I just saw the note that said that I was gone.
Okay,
sorry.
Great. No, it's all right.
Okay. Then toward the end of the 19th century, we move from diffusion and dissemination, although it remains a goal, to popularization. And popularization is when experts supplied the knowledge. They went around talking about it, but there was no, as I said, no intent to have knowledge creation as the key part. There was this idea that there were experts, the experts did the research, the experts told the population about it, and then the population could use it, but they would not be testing it. And also part of this was book clubs, reading clubs. So there was a vast area for this diffusion popularization that has been studied, but again, not adequately. There were periodicals, public lectures, open participation, which morphed into things like in the 1920s, the Book of the Month Club, for example. This is the thumbnail version of the history. So my next big category is higher education. And one thing we need to keep in mind is that when you read books written now and they talk about adults, they'll often start with the veterans returning after World War II and the GI Bill. But in fact, adults have always participated in higher education in the US. And in fact, the antebellum pre-Civil War college, there were two populations that attended college: under 16-year-old and people in their 20s. Most of the colleges. And what would happen was that most of the colleges in the US during this period were remedial schools. And then if someone were really serious about higher education, once they got their degree from one of these local schools, they would go to Harvard, Yale, or Princeton and get a real degree. So as standards for higher education in this country changed, particularly in the post-Civil War period, the adults got edged out, and what we come to think about as more traditionally aged students became more of the norm. But before that, there was no norm for that. And what you see is that in urban areas, starting with the growth in urban transportation, let me go to the next one. I'm going back and forth here. Schools of general studies in major urban areas started. For example, Columbia University, Washington University in St. Louis, and Harvard University all had schools of general studies started in the early 20th century, and you had to be over 25 years old to take part in this because they did not want to compete with their traditionally aged students. And there were many more, but these three actually continue to this day in various permutations. In 1931, you have the New School for Social Research, which was founded by German refugees. And it was an experiment in education because it was totally for adults, although now it has a more traditionally aged population as well. Then in the 1950s, 60s, and especially in the 70s, traditional liberal arts colleges started opening their programs to adults and starting specialized programs for adults. In the 50s, they were for returning women, but starting in the 70s, adults were seen as an alternative revenue stream. And so they were very interested in recruiting adults to their programs, and we see talk of that now. We're seeing a rebirth of an interest in adults in higher education because of the contracting college age population again. And interestingly enough, if we're looking at government intervention here, a lot of these programs were seen as experiments and were funded by the Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education, or FIPSE, and or the Ford Foundation. Then basic education, just looking at my time here. Basic education was to overcome the stigma of literacy, which was really a 20th century issue. So there was always focus on getting adults to read. Teachers were often staying late in the evening to teach adults to read, and this was whites and African Americans and Native Americans. So any school might have a teacher who would come back at night to teach the adults. But it was in the 20th century that there was a bigger stigma over illiteracy, because literacy was seen as the key to industrialization. And the South in particular was trying to industrialize to catch up to the North. And so there was a lot of stigma that began to be attached to illiteracy. And this is an immigrant program, this picture. Particular importance were the programs for immigrants, and this is another one. This is a naturalization program at Hull House in the 1920s. And immigrants were really a big population in the 1920s, Americanization programs were seen as efforts to teach them about America, and this was often seen as being coercive, especially in the workplace. However, the settlement houses and the immigrant clubs themselves also taught English and taught about America, and they did it in a much more humane way. Jane Addams of Hull House called this immigrant gifts. So instead of seeing the immigrant as jumping into the melting pot, the immigrant, yeah? Did someone say something? Nope, guess not.
No, we had someone join us who just needed to mute their mic.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
That's okay.
So, so the immigrant gift was the antithesis of the melting pot. In the melting pot, supposedly, all these different cultures get into a melting pot and become a new culture. But of course, that didn't happen because the cultures maintained their culture. And so Jane Addams saw what immigrants brought as cultural gifts, and it was a sharing. They gave the immigrant culture, all cultures come together and share rather than merging. And as an aside, I will say that the two best known theoreticians about cultural pluralism were an African-American, Alain Locke, who came up with the term, and his good friend Horace Kallen, a Jewish philosopher, and they were both very involved in organized adult education. Locke until his death in 1955, Kallen in and out. So that really, we can look to this pluralistic approach as an important part of what adult education is and has come to be. Work-related learning. Just going to say I have to finish. So work-related learning, these two things, workplace learning and workers' education, they're lumped together under workplace learning, but they're the exact opposite. So workplace learning is learning so that you can improve your job. You're learning for someone else's goal. Workers' education was focused on the individual worker and his or her own development. And they started with very different ideologies. The picture here is of the Brookwood Labor College, which would be classified under workers' education, but it was geared towards self-development and more radical ends, and had nothing to do with doing your job better.
I was just going to ask you, Amy, then, and you're going to go on about this. Does that hold true to today? And why is there a confusion?
I don't know if there's a confusion. It's just they're lumped together in that way. But I think people are pretty clear. What I like is David Noble, who's a historian, I thought best summed up the distinction. And he wrote, he was making a distinction between education and training, which we all make, but he was talking really about this dichotomy as well. And he said the training involves the honing of a person's mind for the purposes of someone other than that person, while education was the opposite, entailing the disassociation, not the disassociation, but the utter integration of knowledge and the self. In a word, self-knowledge. So education, the broader sense, worker education was about self-knowledge, and workplace education was about knowledge that could be consumed to do your job better. I thought that was a really interesting distinction, and it might not be that I could have moved workplace learning into my next category, and that's one of the things about categorization. So this may not work. I may have to move it.
Amy, could you refresh our memory as to who that quote came from?
David Noble.
No, David Noble, thank you.
2001. I do not have the book in front of me, but if you send me an email, I would be happy to give you that reference.
Excellent, thank you.
So and then just to go, so these training programs, they moved to be more structured training. So you start off learning by doing, and then they moved into the classroom. There's been a movement into the classroom, out of the classroom. What is the best way to learn about work? And it's imbued with issues about efficiency and training. And, oh, I have a whole thing about human relations, which I love, but I will skip. So, final piece, social justice and advocacy, which many think is the basis for adult education history. And in some ways it is for adult education. So that adult education comes out of a movement, various movements for social justice and for advocacy. The only thing that I would add to that is that it is not always social justice as a liberal might define it. So for example, the Ku Klux Klan had a very strong adult education program, and their ideal was to pull in the whole family. They had family education programs, they got the women involved, they had book discussions, they had film discussions, and all of this was to keep the family involved in the Klan. And the same for the Nazis. They used adult education in a very similar way, pulling in the whole family, and doing a lot of the same things that we would consider literacy work. They taught people to read. So you can't really say that these social movements all went in one direction. And that's really my major point that I want to bring in here. However, just want to show you some of the ways that the more traditional way of looking at social justice, the social justice pieces that we're more familiar with were aimed at the elimination of poverty, the elimination of racism, and working toward social change on a variety of levels. And one of the most famous, there are many folk schools throughout the US. Some of them were designed to enhance Scandinavian culture, but Highlander Folk School, which many of you might know about, was really an attempt to develop within an Appalachian area. And while it started off encouraging unions, it moved into civil rights work, and it trained, as this shows, Martin Luther King. It also trained Rosa Parks. They helped people working with citizenship schools and teaching literacy throughout the South. And now they're focused on issues more related to Appalachia again. So that's the way that we generally think about it, and that's a rich area that we still need to explore, although it's been looked at a lot. But there's a lot of room here to look at, well, what has been the impact on the field of these? There are many people who would say that adult education has moved away from its roots, but there are reasons for that, having to do with bureaucracy and administration. So if I'm going to summarize, I would say that history is constantly changing. It's constantly being reinterpreted. New people are bringing new ideas to it. There's no one way to think about it. It's not static, and it's contextualized. It has to, and the context is the present, but it's also the past. So you can't just think that if you look at something that happened in the past, you can easily see that it's racist or anti-Semitic, the way they talked, the way these white men talked. Everything was racist, anti-Semitic, anti-woman. Goes without saying. However, they were of a particular time, and you have to understand that time if you're really going to understand what they were talking about. So, the end.
Thank you, Dr. Rose. All right, so we have a few minutes for questions or comments for Dr. Rose. We welcome those right now.
Please, I'm sorry I droned on.
You did not drone.
I meant to end much earlier. Oh, well.
No, it was delightful. I think we were all enthralled with it. I'm interested in the fact, Dr. Rose, that a lot of my colleagues, especially in higher education, don't seem to understand that social justice and advocacy has really come from adult learning and adult education. They there's a lack of understanding, I think, about us. What would you say to that, or how might I address that with my
That's a
colleagues?
tough one. That's a tough one because I'm not sure that you can make the argument that it came from adult
Okay.
education. But I would say that adult education has probably spent more time trying to understand that and deal with it than other areas of education. For example, in the period between the wars, there were many studies and huge concern about trying to figure out the difference between propaganda and education. And that was coming from adult educators for the most part. And so, because there was a fear that propaganda, and yes, of course, it was the communists, but it was also the fear that propaganda had gotten us into World War I, and we didn't want propaganda to get us into World War II. And so, I think the argument is, where does this fit into adult education really? And that gets us to the bigger question, which is one I've been grappling with most recently, which is, how do we define the field? And how do we get ourselves into trouble by defining it so broadly that it's everything? Because once you do that, it's very difficult to persuade your colleagues in higher education that you have a unique purview.
Yes, that I think that's very relevant. That's very valuable.
So, and that is exactly how I got into what I'm doing now, because we're really grappling with that in the field right now.
Okay.
Okay, so may I ask the question, Leslie?
Yes.
Okay, so Dr. Rose, that was excellent. Thank you
Please
so
call
much.
me Amy,
Thank
please.
you. Oh, Amy, it was great. Thank you. But so, and this is probably sort of silly, but do you classify traditional age college students as a part of adult education or not?
I do not. I'll give you the quick answer because I
Okay.
know it's a big area of debate, but there are certainly people, and this is where there are traditionally aged college students who have children and jobs, and they may be more closer to the adult population than the traditionally aged full-time student, of which there are few. But so there is a gray area there, like community college students who are traditionally older, they would be often classified as adult. I mean, it's not chronological, but we do start with 24 or 25 usually. And the reason for that, and it may not be the right thing given all the other things that are happening, but we also want to distinguish ourselves from higher education. And if we say, well, all students are adult education, again, what are we talking about? And it may be that we have things to say that apply to the general student population. In fact, we do. A lot of the techniques and methods that were pioneered for adults have made their way in different permutations to the traditionally aged students. Take portfolios, for example. I mean, they came from art first, but they were also part of prior learning assessment. And then they've kind of taken off and taken a life of their own. But I guess I draw a hard line, and that was probably from my experience as a co-editor of Adult Education Quarterly. So when people would send us articles about the traditionally aged students that had absolutely no relevance to adult educators, we would say that they were out of scope.
Thank you.
But it's a big question. Because now we talk about lifelong and life-wide, because we recognize that traditionally aged students can be very diverse. So it's not that easy. I recognize that.
That helped tremendously. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Rose. Even though we do call you Amy, we were delighted with you today and this wonderful presentation. We've had many different thanks and comments about filling our minds with different kinds of questions and new quests for knowledge out there. I think this has been very helpful. for many of us. So I would say thank you to all of you for joining us also. If you would like to see the archive for this presentation, it will be posted at the AAACE website under the Compendium. I have shared that information and that link with you in the Zoom group chat. We would like to also remind you that there will be another compendium, or another two in this series for the compendium, one on August 14th that has to do with mentoring, and we'll have Dr. Catherine Hansman, who is a colleague of Dr. Rose's, and then also in October, after our AAACE conference, we'll have another one on case-based learning and the idea of integrating case scenarios into learning with a few of our colleagues. So thank you so much.
Leslie,
yes,
can I
Amy.
say one thing?
Yes.
Someone asked for the Noble reference again, and I have to close my screen in order to get it. So.
Okay. It's okay. He got that information. I think he can find it, and he realizes that he can email you or I, Amy, if he has any questions.
Okay, arose@niu.edu.
Oh,
okay?
Excellent. Arose at niu.edu.
It was at the beginning. It should have been at the end.
All right. Well, thank you. It's at the top of the hour, and you all have a good rest of the day. This is the end to the presentation, and we hope to see you soon.
And I'm glad I see my ICD friends there.
Yeah.